Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Biblio Files. This is the show on AADL TV, where each episode we take a few minutes to talk about one book topic. And the topic that we are discussing today is science, books about science. I am Lucy, and as usual, I am here with Christopher and Amanda, and our special science correspondent, Jackie, is with us today as well. So Jackie, we are excited to have you. Christopher, what book did you pick?
Well, I read Fuzz by Mary Roach, and this is on a 2021 Science Friday list. Lucy, did you also read this? So I had never heard of Mary Roach before, but she wrote a lot of books with one-word topics like Stiff, Spook, Bonk, Grunt, and now Fuzz. So this is her most recent book, and it's all about human-animal conflict, or in some cases, human-plant conflict. And she travels the world looking at a lot of different things like crime scene investigations of animal attacks and elephants that get drunk and trample crops, or man-eating leopards, and I've got a few other ones here. Oh, bears in cities, and there are a lot of things that she looks at. So this is really about kind of the edges of conflict between humans and wildlife. One particularly funny episode was the 2017 Easter morning attack of seagulls that ravaged all the daffodils on St. Peter's Square in Vatican City. And Roach, with her typical humor, calls the seagulls very dickish, which I thought was really funny. So the book does have a lot of humor in it. At one point, she compares the yellow-eyed penguin to 1970s Bowie, which I thought was really funny. But I did learn a lot. There were a lot of great science words that I've been missing. So that was really, really cool. I wish there was just a little bit more of a wrap up or a little bit more of a lesson that I could take from the book, but it was still a great introduction to her work. And we'll see what Lucy has to say about it as well. So Jackie, what did you read for this episode?
I read Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are by Franz de Waal. He is a primatologist by training, written quite a few different books, such as Our Inner Ape, The Bonobo and the Atheist. And so I've read some of his other works before. This one came out in 2015, 2017, something like that. It's been out for a few years. It's just a particularly interesting topic. And even though I have a million science books that I love, there have been two in my life in particular that have been kind of awe-inspiring. Like you have like an aha moment. And I debated between the two. The other one is The Beak of the Finch. But I decided to talk about this one today because it's newer. So it's talking about some things that are, I think, a little bit more groundbreaking. So basically, it's a comparative view of the philosophy and the research that goes into our understanding of animal cognition. And he's not necessarily introducing any new concepts. He's kind of just taking the whole field and introducing the reader to it. He looks at how science has traditionally studied non-human primates, and then more pointedly, how we've tried to rank and value cognition in other families and species of animals. And it basically asks, do we even know what we're doing? Like, he really does ask that question. Because basically, science tends to spend a lot of time trying to reproduce human-like characteristics in other animals and then judging them for not producing human-like characteristics. Mm-hmm. So if we think that intelligence is language use, but we don't think that it is something that's completely necessary for the survival of another species, is it fair for us to judge, right? So if science, what he asks, like, what is intelligence? What is consciousness? Is it being able to communicate with language, recognize a face, use a tool? Why can't it be an insect that divides its time feeding between two different plants in order to make sure it has the ideal diet for its development? Why can't it be a spider that pretends to be a struggling insect on the edge of another spider's web and it learns by trial and error? Like, how is that not intelligence, right? But that's not something that you hear science or popular culture talk about. Like, insect intelligence is not commonly a thing. And it really challenges a lot of our beliefs about where we rank, how we feel about what we eat, lots of different things, right? So the field of evolutionary cognition requires us to consider every species in full. This is a quote from the book, and I think it was absolutely perfect. So I'm going to read this. The field of evolutionary cognition requires us to consider every species in full, whether we are studying hand anatomy, trunk multifunctionality, face perception, or greeting rituals. We need to familiarize ourselves with all facets of the animal and its natural history before trying to figure out its mental level. Instead of testing animals on abilities that we are particularly good at, our own species' magic wells, such as language, why not test them on their specialized skills? In doing so, we will not just flatten Aristotle's scale of nature, we will transform it into a bush with many branches. This change in perspective is now feeding the long overdue recognition that intelligent life is not something we must seek at great expense only in the outer reaches of space. It is abundant here on Earth, right underneath our non-prehensile noses. So I learned a lot because it's heavily laden with research and interesting findings, but it's also, he does such a great job of not really trying to convince the reader, although he's making points that, you know, a lot of scientific experiments are not well designed. They're not new ideas. You know, a lot of times he's talking about, well, we know it wasn't well designed because when someone redesigned it using tools that a monkey with essentially a less functional thumb could actually pick up, all of a sudden their intelligence was not in question anymore, right? So he goes into a lot of detail about how the idea of human exceptionalism is a problem, and it's contributed to habitat destruction and forests being bulldozed and all kinds of things. And I think the idea of exceptionalism in general is something that, you know, we're trying, like, our society is trying to, you know, come to terms with. So I think some of what he talks about goes beyond the scope of evolutionary cognition, and it's something we need to all think about. But he does it in such a great way. There's so many little anecdotal stories about, like, interesting scientists who said these, like, really, like, kind of awe-inspiring things, just like at some random conference that nobody's ever really talked about, or stories about there's one where they were trying to test whether elephants can recognize themselves in mirrors, but they just kept destroying the mirrors because the elephants were so excited that they were trying to, like, check out behind the mirror and stuff, but it was, like, sort of proving the point, but they weren't able to really prove it in the study because they just kept destroying the mirrors, because they just don't make mirrors that stand up to giant bull elephants, right? So apparently the standard response to, like, an interesting mirror is to, you know, gently nudge it with your tusks. Well, that doesn't work so well. So it's a great book. Franz de Waal has written so many really interesting books about humans and animals. So this is not my first one. I also recommend Our Inner Ape, but yeah, this is great. I learned a lot. All right, well, let's see. Amanda, what did you read and what did you think about it?
Well, I think it's interesting so far. I also chose a book about animals. So I think it's interesting. There are so many, like you say, you're going to do an episode on science. There are so many different, you know, categories of science. We could have talked about books about astronomy or, like, physics or meteorology. But I think that as humans, we are so curious about animals and how much they differ or are similar to humans. Just like we love animals that we can have, like, as domesticated for pets or on farms. So I think it's interesting just to think about that in respect to science. But the book I chose is the book Menagerie Manor by Gerald Durrell. And I randomly found this book while I was pulling some books for a display at the downtown library. And I'm familiar with Gerald Durrell because I had watched the television adaptation of one of his books, My Family and Other Animals, which talks about him being a child on the Greek Isle of Corfu and his quirky, interesting family. And he was obsessed with animals, and he would just bring them home, and the house is just full of all these animals. And I thought the show was just so endearing and wonderful. And I haven't read the book, but I saw this book. It was slim, less than 200 pages. And I thought, yes, that's a book about science. I want to read that, because I was genuinely curious and wanted to read one of his books. And I'm so happy that I randomly found it. So this book was published in 1964. And it talks about the first 5 years of him finally reaching his lifelong dream of wanting to own a zoo. So the book, or the zoo, started in 1959, and it was the Durrell Wildlife Park, and it still exists. It is called the Jersey Zoo, and it is on the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. And the book doesn't talk about how to start a zoo or like some of the trials and tribulations of doing so. It's more focused on the animals. And it's mostly just like some of the stories and anecdotes of the animals and some of the antics and things that happened while they were in the zoo. Now, the book was published in 64. And so between 59 and 64, what zoos were then and are now are very different, and even like animal welfare and care. So the zoo focused on having like rare and endangered species. But as far as like how the pens were made or some of the things the animals did or didn't do or how they made the zoo would be different in today's light. And I don't want to put into or make it seem like animal behaviors exist only for humans, like, entertainment. But for this book, the book, you understand his passion and love for animals and taking care of them and wanting to keep them alive, and especially ones that are endangered or are in jeopardy. And so I just appreciate his passion and love for animals. And just having watched the show that was based on a book of him falling in love with animals and taking care of them and learning about them and just being surrounded by them all the time. So here he is as an adult with him and his wife and his mom, and they're on this island, and he has the zoo with all of these animals. So it's a lot of like funny, charming stories about the variety of animals. And there's different kinds of monkeys, there's snakes, turtles, of assorted birds. And so it tells you, and I really enjoyed getting to know some of these species of birds that I can't repeat now or pronounce because I didn't bookmark them, but still learn a little bit about how even wild animals can have such distinct and wonderful personalities, and you can get to know them. And some just don't want anything to do with humans, and others do build that relationship with humans. So I really enjoyed seeing his passion and drive for this lifelong dream of running a zoo come to fruition. And then just to meet the variety of animals, and they all have names, just meeting these animals and seeing how they interact with each other, and then how they adapt from being elsewhere to coming into the zoo. So I just thought the book was really wonderful. He writes in such a generous, like tender tone. For me, when I was reading the book, I was picturing Bill Bryson's voice in my head because it has that English soft-spoken male voice. And I've listened to his books on audio. So I was imagining like Bill Bryson narrating, because I haven't heard Gerald Durrell read a book. So I was imagining this. So it had a similar sort of like dry humor as Bryson's book do as well, which I totally love. So for me, that was sort of an interesting way to look at it. So that is Menagerie Manor by Gerald Durrell. Lucy, did you pick the same book as Christopher, or what did you pick?
I did pick the same book as Christopher, which I'll talk about in a moment. But my dad is a huge Gerald Durrell fan. So I have been hearing stories from his books forever, and I just love them. So I also picked Fuzz by Mary Roach. And I have been wanting to read a Mary Roach book for a long time. And I happen to have this one. And so I went ahead and read it. And I loved it. I love her sense of humor. She is great at these footnotes. Like she'll put them in, and the footnotes are really where her humor sometimes shines. So they're so super important to read. But as Christopher said, she's talking about the way that like natural animal urges bring certain animals into friction with basically human systems, right? It's like systems that humans have put in place, and the amount of effort that humans will put into controlling and redirecting what is essentially animal behavior. And it doesn't work. And I love the way that she sets the book up, because she goes, it's like this meandering journey, but she starts big and kind of go small. And as she puts it in her introduction, the first half of the book considers the felony crimes. So she's talking about like murder and manslaughter, serial killing, aggravated assault, as she says, grand theft, sunflower seed. The name of the book is, I mean, it's Fuzz, but then it's When Nature Breaks the Law. So it's, it's kind of a little bit sarcastic there, because whose law is being broken? So I love the way she does that. She starts with these bears and cougars, and then you hear about how elephants are actually responsible for a lot of human deaths, and gets into smaller and smaller animals like monkeys. And then at one point she's talking about stoats, and which was actually one of my favorite parts of the book. It's the part with a yellow-eyed penguin, which is extremely rare in New Zealand. And part of it is because they're very solitary. And so when they do all their mating and living, they want to do it alone. They have to cross like a lot of terrain to get where they're going. So they get picked off. And the story of how stoats were introduced into New Zealand is that when English moved to New Zealand, they were missing hunting. So they brought 6 rabbits into New Zealand, and 6 rabbits very quickly turns into millions of rabbits. So then New Zealand's overrun with rabbits. So then they bring stoats in to get rid of the rabbits, and now it's overrun with stoats, which are killing off the penguins. And that's just like a very simplified version of the story, but she goes in detail through all these things. And some of the people she runs into when she's discovering these things have the most unusual job titles. For instance, human elephant conflict specialist, or bear manager, or danger tree faller blaster is a good one. So those are actually job titles that people have in the world. So humor aside, one thing I did take away from this book is that, and she says it in the book, like she has started to develop a different attitude towards pests, like what we consider pests, because bears would fall on the list of pests. And, but we always consider these small things that seem to be able to get into our space, we consider them pests. And really they're just following their animal urges, and and our systems are getting in their way. And this was particularly meaningful to me because I personally have been learning to coexist with a mouse in my house. And it's really been making me think a lot about, like, can I coexist with this mice? And I know everyone says where there's a mouse, there's mice, but I have only seen the one. And it has the same patterns every day. It does the same things. We trapped this mouse. We released her. We thought far enough away. This mouse came back. So it's like that for me, I think was meaningful because I could really connect to it. But I also think that in general, it was a good lesson about how we think about the ways we interact with all the animals that we consider to be invading our world, when in fact, it's their world first. So that is Fuzz, and which Christopher read as well. I'm so happy that I did read a Mary Roach book, and I certainly will be reading more of them. So lots of animals on our science episode, as you were saying, Amanda. Does anyone else have any thoughts about science or animals?
Lucy, you're making me wonder what animals get to call us pests.
Yeah.
All of them?
All of them, probably.
Yeah.
I would like to think that in a parallel universe, there is a set of 4 non-humans doing a Zoom recording for an episode of, Animal Files, and they are discussing those strange creatures known as humans and all of the things that they do.
Right. And they're calling us like fuzzless, even though we have,
theoretically they could talk about the same books we talked about and just like spin them, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They could just talk about how humans don't do well in tests about how to tell exactly what to eat for our ideal health. Because if you give me a plate of greens, I'm not able to tell what combination of them I should consume for, exactly as much vitamin A as I need, right?
Yeah, we are unique in that way as a species, right? Like we cannot figure out what foods to put in our body to keep ourselves healthy. And most other animals can do that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Well, as always, we would love to hear from you, our viewers, what you are reading. If you have a favorite science book, we would love to know it. You can leave us a comment below, and we will see you next time on Bibliophiles. Before we leave, I want to thank Jackie very much for joining us for this special science episode. Thank you, Jackie. It was fun to have you here.
Thanks for having me.